The Mayo Experience.
That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. That Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, a special Friday hang today because we're reaching outside of the world of the regular schmoes that I have on. And now we're bringing in the new commentator, color guy for the World Poker Tour, Tony Dunst. Tony, man, congratulations. This is, well, I mean, now that Mike Sexton's gone, you're now the third person to join that booth ever. That's big history.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a history that I'm very happy to make. As we were talking about a little earlier, I grew up watching the World Poker Tour. Like, this is one of the shows that got me into the game. So to become the host, the co-host of the show feels amazing. Feels kind of surreal.
Well, I think that you and I are approximately around the same age, and I kind of got the exact same thing into it as well. Like, the World Poker Tour comes along, the moneymaker thing happens a little slightly before, poker's blowing up, and in Canada, we had the NHL lockout, so the only thing that was on TV was poker. They couldn't produce enough poker at the time, and it just filled up the airwaves, and that made it kind of huge in Canada, weirdly enough, that everyone just kind of got into it. Now, I was playing 3-4 times a week, and then getting to online. It just turned out that it was unsustainable because I was so terrible at poker. But you stuck around with it and made it work.
Yeah, I stuck around, and I fell in with a great group of friends who were really successful at the game and really thoughtful players. So as they were evolving the game online, I was kind of tagging along and learning from them. And one weird thing is, like you said, poker kind of supplanted hockey on TV. And I guess when hockey came back from its break, they found that like ESPN had filled their slot in such a way and was getting such good ratings from poker that they were like, well, we'll see when we get you back, hockey. Like, we'll work that out later. Like, poker was crushing when it first came out around the era you're talking about.
And even now that the poker popularity has dwindled a bit since the heydays of the poker boom, it probably still does the same ratings as the NHL, and it's about 1/100th the price to produce.
Yeah, I can't speak for the NHL's production costs, but I'm pretty confident that ours are lower. And we are fortunate that there is definitely a niche audience that has sustained a really genuine interest in poker. And something I've been talking to a lot of live poker players about recently on the tour is it feels like the last few years, live tournaments in the United States have gotten better, have gotten bigger, have gotten softer. So I feel like we are seeing a little bit of a resurgence.
Well, how big is it going to be the day that the government finally says, you know what, you can play poker online again?
My guess is that's going to continue to happen on a state-by-state level instead of the federal level. I think the way the government is approaching things in the United States is, okay, this is an issue that does not, for whatever reason, lend itself to federal regulation. So one big piece of news that came out really recently is that the player pools of the online sites in New Jersey and Nevada are going to start sharing their liquidity. So I think as more and more states are added to the player pool, we'll start to see something that represents the type of online poker you and I grew up with.
So as soon as the states get their rake, then it's going to be fine again, basically?
More or less, yes.
Are you following along with this sports betting bill at all that's going through? Because I feel like if that goes through, it could just basically break the levee of everything happening.
Yes, very much. I think this is a really important piece of legislation, both for the gambling industry, but also for our culture as a whole, because we're talking about something that was viewed as vice in the United States for a really long time, entering the realm of legitimate business the way it is really across the rest of the world, and in my opinion deserves to be. And that would just be such a enormous win for the gambling industry and open up a world of possibilities.
Okay, so I want to switch back into the poker broadcasting for a second, just because I have a lot of questions about it. So you win out a competition to host the Raw Deal segment on the WPT. How many people did you go up against, and how did you think, like, hey, I'm going to beat everyone out? Like, did you have previous broadcasting experience?
There was a few hundred people who entered that or auditioned or sent in videos. And I was a theater major, but did not have any broadcasting experience. So I had some practice at public speaking and speaking into a camera a little bit. But I was very confident going in because I felt like I had a good mix of the necessary experience for what they were looking for. Like they really did need an authentic professional poker player to do that segment, which took away competition from anyone who had more in terms of broadcasting experience. And then amongst poker players, very few of them are extroverted or have a lot of practice at public speaking. So I felt in both realms I had a nice edge in my competition.
So when you move into the commentary slot, how different is that going to be? Like, had you done any play-by-play on things before? Have you like watched tape on Mike, got advice from him, watched say the Norman Chad broadcast on ESPN to kind of develop the cadence of how it goes, or he's going to bring something completely new to it?
Well, unfortunately, the World Poker Tour gave me their online stream for 7 years leading up to this transition. So that gave me a lot of practice at more traditional broadcasting. And those are like 6 to 8 hour broadcasts. So you certainly learn the ability to always come up with something to say. Whereas last season, Mike made 2 final tables. And so I partnered with Vince. And between that and doing 1 season of our Alpha 8 High Roller series, he and I have been able to develop a chemistry that was pretty natural to step into the booth with this season. So there hasn't been any, awkward development period between the two of us.
Well, when you go from something like a live stream that can last up to 8 hours and you're just constantly talking, trying to fill time, you're like, if you did 2 ends of a baseball doubleheader, that's essentially what it would end up being like, except for that the downtime between hands is almost like the downtime in between batters coming up to the plate, and then you have your inning breaks. But when it's condensed to, let's say, 2 hours to put on TV and you're only seeing the most fire hands going, is there something different that you need to bring? Obviously, you don't need to fill as much time, but you need to be far more concise when you do it.
Absolutely. So when you're doing that like 8 hour broadcast, you just need to keep the energy at a steady 6, out of 10 the entire time, and keep your audience engaged. But you obviously can't be at your peak for the entire broadcast. It's not realistic. Whereas when you do a televised product, what they need your energy to be like an 8 to 10 when they're filming. They need you to really bring it and feel like you're so excited for what's happening in front of you. And then the second the camera is off, your energy can drop back to like a 2. You can kind of zone out. You can come and go with the action in the middle of the hand. Be like, oh wow, a big pot's developing here. Let's go ahead and lead into this one or something. And if you want to zone out during the middle of a hand that seems inconsequential, while we're filming, that's okay. Whereas while we're doing a stream, you really had to pay attention to everything that was happening at the table, so you could articulate to your audience what was going on.
Yeah, I remember for ages, I would always tell a couple of my buddies, just being like, hey, when ESPN moved the November 9 to 2 months after, and you only had the live final table, I never thought there would be live poker on TV. I frankly just thought it would be too boring. And it turns out that there was a market for it. And even if you couldn't see the whole cards, that's when having the real expert analysis came in, that you needed someone to basically decipher what the hands were. Because you would go back and watch these ones from like the late 80s when like Johnny Chan and Phil Hellmuth were winning and be like, yeah, I think he might have 10s. It's like, let's see how this plays out. And then you would never see what the cards were. At least at the end on these live streams, after the hand is over, they will show you what the cards were to see how everything was. But do you think that the market for, I guess, content is king, and the more you can fill, even if it's an online stream, 8 hours is better than 3 hours. So do you think that there's a room for live poker?
Yeah, I do. And I think that the audiences are actually fairly different between an online stream and a produced televised product. I think with the online stream, you get serious poker players and poker enthusiasts and people who want to see what are the top level professionals doing with their decisions in all these small spots that lead up to the big consequential hands that we see on TV. Whereas your TV audience mostly kind of just wants entertainment. They probably approach watching poker a little more like, this is just a sport that I watch for some fun, or this is like a game show and I like to see who gets the money. And I just want a few clever lines from the commentary without diving too deep into the strategy. So I do think the way you approach your commentary and the subjects that you pay attention to and highlight should be different.
Well, it's always fun when, like, I always like to have poker on at the gym when I'm watching TV. It's just something just like, hey, I can watch this for an hour. This is going to be perfect. But I know if there's 5 minutes left in the episode, it's like, well, someone's going to get sucked out on here.
Yeah, exactly. You know when it ends.
So when you do the commentary for the TV broadcast, are you doing that while it's going on, or do you go back after the fact, after the edit's done, and then revoice it, or is it like a mix of both?
It's both, but most of the commentary you hear on an episode of the World Poker Tour is done in post-production. So what you see of us at the final table, all of that is filmed live, and we do some intros, outros, introductions of players. We get some natural reactions of us, responding to a big hand that just happened. But a huge percentage of what you actually hear during an episode is post-production.
Do you guys ever, let's say there's like weather problems or you can't get to the event. Have you ever done it in front of a green screen?
No, the Raw Deal segment was filmed in front of a green screen, but we are fortunate. This is not the NBA. We don't have our roofs all of a sudden start leaking and we got to cancel the game,
All right, so I read about your story. There was a really nice feature on Card Player. But I wanted to ask you, like when you're traveling around the world and you leave college and then you end up in Australia and China and all these places, why start writing about poker? Because I get this question a lot about being, whether it's talking about fantasy, daily fantasy, betting, that kind of thing. It's like, why do you write about it? Why don't you just bet? And I always just liked writing, and I'm much better at writing than I am at doing any of those things. So but you're having a lot of success being a poker player. Why get into blogging and writing about it?
Initially, it was just a spillover of my enthusiasm for the game and the fact that I just felt very lucky and grateful that I was in this world that I wanted to be a part of so bad. And like you said, I just liked writing. I like to be creative, and so journaling what it was like in this world and through my travels was just something that came very natural to me. But I understand your question in that, as a professional gambler, you do need to be conscious about the kind of information that you give away, especially to people who could potentially be your competition.
The one good thing that when it's like something like sports betting, you can give tips, and if your tips are good, everyone can win. When it's something like daily fantasy or something like poker, you start giving away tips, then everyone else is just beating you at this point.
Exactly, yeah. So you really do have to be conscious of that.
Fortunately, I'm terrible, so if people take my picks, joke's on them. But
so if I do the opposite of your picks,
then you'll be a big winner.
All right.
I think that's the only reason that people actually tune into my show. Involved in that feature is something I was very curious about. Just like growing up, you're into games, different types of games. And it seems like now that online poker can't really be played all that accessibly in the United States, that a lot of former poker pros, at least online ones, have shifted over into the daily fantasy market because that's what they can do. What is it about poker, about daily fantasy, and then even growing up playing board games, playing card games, not necessarily even like numeric card games, whether it be like Riven or something like that, just what is the connection between all those things? Is it seeing the patterns in the cards, understanding probability, or is it just the fun of playing games?
I think it's a mix of things. I think it's appreciating the strategy that goes into games. I think it's respecting the math and statistics that make up your decision making in these games. And then in the case of poker and DFS, it's enjoying gambling. I do still find it fun to have money at risk, or to be deep in a tournament, or to have like a potentially big score in a DFS contest and get that little bit of a rush that you get anytime you might potentially win or lose money. That's always very fun. But I do appreciate diving deep into the strategy of these games and figuring out how you optimize your decisions in all these various nuanced ways and all these various situations that come up. Especially poker is constantly evolving and your opponents are trying to outthink you. And in DFS, you have to find leverage on the field in all these various ways and again stay one step ahead of people, and just problem solving like that intrigues me.
Well, if you just to compare different styles of poker, if you're playing online and you're playing live, does probability across the board is always going to be the same probability, but does it make sense to take fewer chances in an online game and just stick solely to the probabilities because you're seeing so many more hands per hour than it would in a live game?
I think it makes sense to go outside the traditional strategy or probabilities in the live arena because you have the additional information in the form of live tells and live reads. So when we're playing online, we're essentially in a vacuum. And if we know something about our opponent, it's because we have been taking notes or we have a piece of tracking software that tells us about that player's tendencies. Whereas live, not only do you have that little database that you've built up from observing this player in the time you've played together, or in the time you've asked people around the room, how does this guy play? What are his moves? But also as you're watching people, some of them are very apt to give away the strength or lack of strength in their hand based on their demeanor, their tells, the speed at which they move, the confidence with which they act. And so having that additional piece of information allows you to divert from the line, from the strategy you may take online when you didn't have that.
So when you're going to the tables for the first time and you're new at this and you're trying to up yourself a level and you're going against these like seasoned poker pros who have a lot of experience with basically primarily live poker, not just like a mix between online and live and everything like that. How do you hide your tells? And do people tell you what's going on? Do you have to figure it out for yourself? Is that why having buddies around can kind of inform you like, hey man, like every time that you have a strong hand, you start like snapping your fingers or rolling your chips in between your fingers. Like how long does it take to catch up to get to that pro level of live poker?
Well, I will say that in the early years, most online players told themselves, let's just be a statue. And so that can be very effective at hiding your strength and not giving away tells. But that led to criticism of my generation of players for making the game boring to watch. Because if you put a lot of us on a televised table, we generally just kind of sit there very still. We move kind of slowly. We don't speak very much. We're really not trying to give anything away because there's a lot of money at risk. When you're first adjusting to the live arena, that's naturally your tendency if you're thinking about things. And then, like you said, if you have a group of peers that you work on this game with, they'll try and let you know anything that they catch on your demeanor. But ideally, as a professional, you learn to conceal your tells pretty early, and then you shift focus to discovering other people's tells.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the statue thing because that's one of the reasons, like, I kind of dwindled a bit out of poker. That and I was terrible at online poker, and I saw all my friends winning tens of thousands of dollars. I was like, how come I can't do this? Like, we beat you guys when we meet up on Thursday night. You put them online, and they're playing 12 tables at once, and they're absolutely steamrolling everyone. And a lot of people didn't do this, and clearly you've embraced this, but when it starts becoming on TV, and there's big money at stake in terms of advertising revenue in this, how much does being entertaining to an extent come in at the table? Because the names that have persisted in poker throughout the years are not only good players, there's a lot of really good players, but it's the ones that we remember are the ones that continuously get invited back to play in these televised events, and the players that have the giant social media followings, and then they can sell things through that. It seems like again, almost to go back to the writing thing, and you see a lot of like top-end either gamblers or daily fantasy players, they own websites where they sell content. Like, there's always a baseline safety in that revenue coming in over the volatility of actually playing for some of this money. How much did that factor into you when you really started to think about it?
In my case, I became aware that there was potential for me to earn off the felt probably midway through my career. But in the early stages, I was much like other online players where if I made a major televised final table, like trying to entertain the audience didn't really cross my mind. I don't care. Most of them don't care, and I don't blame them for not caring because there's so much money at stake, and the opportunity to win that kind of money comes along so infrequently that I really don't think you should do anything to get yourself off your normal pattern or get yourself off your normal strategy or do something that just feels unnatural to you just to entertain a crowd when there's really not very much upside for you. Whereas these guys who have built a brand for themselves, they now have this really strong incentive to perform when they make a televised final table or when they're invited on a televised poker program. And that was something that I sort of learned along the way because it was unnatural to me at the beginning. And I thought it was very redundant if you could make enough money just gambling. You don't have to entertain. But as I entered the world of media and television, I was like, okay, this is now a really, really important component of how I make a living. So if I make a televised final table, I need to go out of my way to be more talkative, to actually show something in my face about the way that I'm feeling after a hand occurs, to interact with the audience. All of these are the kind of things that, my generation of robots, and I use that term affectionately, my generation of robots simply would not have bothered with.
So when it goes into that and the presentation aspect of it, especially doing media, you said you had a theater background, but you dress really well when you're on the air. You don't look like a slob when you go on. Clearly you stay in good shape, like you're a very presentable individual. Is that a strategic plan, or is that just something you like to do in your lifestyle?
It's both, but I mean, when you learn to think strategically in poker and in daily fantasy sports, it starts to spill over to other areas of your life. And I remember in psychology class in like high school and university, they told us about things like the halo effect, where people tend to thin slice. They tend to derive their impression and assumptions about people off a fairly small amount of information, a lot of it aesthetic and based on appearance or presentation. And so they showed us these videos where people would go in for job interviews, and one of them would be, an average looking person, and one of them would be like a very well groomed, attractive person. And the response that they got was so drastically different that it left a very permanent impression in my mind that appearance is a potential edge. It's something that you can have an advantage in life if you want to put the energy and time into manicuring something like that. And, within the world of entertainment, it's obviously super important. So it's just kind of something that I keep up with because holistically it makes a lot of sense for the way I approach life.
So what do you do? Like what is, because I mean, you don't, okay, is it actually true that you don't own or rent a house?
That's true, yes.
So do you, obviously you're not sleeping on the streets going city to city, but like, are you just working so much that you're constantly traveling, or do you just have like preferred couches at your friend's house that you really enjoy?
It is a combo of the two. Certainly over the last few years, I was working and traveling and playing so much poker that I didn't really have that much downtime, and it would have been a total waste of money to be paying rent in an apartment that I was simply never home to. And so I would often stay in hotels and Airbnbs around the casinos, sometimes with a friend, whether they had a spare room or a couch. I am really good at sleeping on planes, or just like, well, we've got a few hours to kill here in the airport. I'm going to lie down in that corner and set an alarm. Like, I've gotten to the point where I can just very easily fall asleep anywhere if I'm tired. But I did try and eventually build kind of a little social system of people who were willing to tolerate my presence in their home for a few nights anytime I was around.
So for me, when I'm thinking about dieting, I'm thinking about working out. I have a very strict regimen. I like the consistency of day to day. I go at this time, I eat at this time. This is what I eat on this day. This is how I work out on this day. When I start traveling, it gets completely thrown out of whack. How do you deal with that? Like, if you're constantly in airports and you're traveling around, like, there's certain things that you just don't eat, or do you say, screw it, I'm at the airport, calories don't count here?
When I'm in the kind of routine where I'm attempting to cut weight, I am really strict and I just don't make exceptions. And, you're absolutely right that when it comes to working out and being healthy, having a routine is a big part of that. But once travel becomes the routine, then it's just, okay, how do I incorporate that old routine into this new one? And so I'm often finding gyms on like Google and Yelp and like, walking a mile or something from wherever hotel or Airbnb I'm at to buy a day pass or a week pass or something, and just to make it work so I can get in there. Often hotels or Airbnbs are going to have a gym in the building where you can go down and get 75% of what you want to do done, and that's pretty good on most days. And then a lot of the year, I eat whatever I want and just try and be conscious of moderation. Try not to eat 6,000 calories in a day. If I want to eat some junk, that's fine. Just like don't go crazy with it. And then very small but intense portions of the year, I am dieting and being really, really conscious of what I eat. And those are the hardest periods, actually, not because it's that difficult to eat healthy if I'm at an airport or something like that. I find the hardest part is socializing, because you go to dinners or you're hanging out with people and they're like, all right, what are you drinking? And you're like, water. And they're like, why? And you're like, well, I'm trying to cut some weight. And they're like, you're not fat. And you got to go down this sequence over and over and over again with people. And so I often find myself getting a little antisocial whenever I am on a really, really strict regimen.
Yeah, it always happens to me when I try to quit smoking. Not that that comes around very often, but every time you end up going out, it's just like, hey, you're the guy who always has the cigarettes. Where are the cigarettes? Like, oh, you've lent me so many over the years. Here, have some cigarettes. Yeah. It's the greatest. It's the greatest thing in the world, getting free cigarettes. But I'm trying to cut back. You're like, no, you're not. Don't worry about that. I'm the one who doesn't smoke. You're the one who does smoke. Have these. It's just like, no, I'm trying to scale back here just a little bit. But even to your
cigarette karma, you got to use it now.
Yeah. So you mentioned Airbnb, you mentioned Yelp, you mentioned Google. How feasible would your lifestyle be if you weren't able to do it all from your phone?
Not at all. I mean, I don't drive either. I just take Yelp and Uber, or not Yelp and Uber, Lyft and Uber everywhere. I find restaurants on Yelp. I book all of my flights on my computer or my phone. I'm doing daily fantasy sports on my phone. I mean, I'm communicating across so many different networks with people all over the world, and I'm placing bet and all these kinds of things just all through my phone. And so, yeah, it would absolutely be impossible to maintain this lifestyle without it.
When you talk about the broadcasting, and one of the things is the visceral and visual appeal and the aesthetics of everything that comes through, I always try to tell this to people. It's funny because I came from the internet to TV, back to the internet. And when people are trying to get themselves up and going, like there's a lot of people with vlogs out there, and the ones that really stand out, no matter how good they are, you could have the best content in the world, but I always tell people, just buy a light. It's like $60 LED, and put it right in front of your camera, shine it on you. It'll improve your product by like 40%. If people stumble across it, they'll be like, hey, on your phone, they're like, this looks pretty good. I'll tune in to see what they have to say. If you look terrible, then people just aren't willing to give you a chance in that realm. So if anyone out there is watching, trying to start up like a Twitch stream or anything like that, buy a light, buy a decent microphone, and you're well on your way. Your computer camera is probably good enough. I mean, these things, especially like if you set up your phone to do it, the phone cameras now are just out of this world. In terms of, I just mentioned the apps, and you mentioned Lyft, you mentioned Uber. So does that mean you're constantly on like Bumble and Tinder the entire time?
I used to use the dating apps quite a bit while traveling, but I also like meeting people in real life. I'm a little bit old-fashioned like that. And I think that, approaching a woman in real life has a greater impact now because the apps have become the status quo. I think that so many people construct their dating lives online now that when you go up to a person in real life and you're like, hey, I wanted to meet you, they're just like, whoa, oh my God, I can't believe you're doing this. So I still appreciate that, as old-fashioned as it sounds. I do use the apps at times. One difficulty I find with the apps is that, say, something like Bumble, you swipe a little bit, and then maybe you get a match, and then maybe you get a phone number from that match, and then you try and set a date. And when you factor in, like, how long it takes to go through that process, and the fact that girls aren't, like, grinding away on these apps, they use them a little more infrequently. If you only have, like, a week in town, these apps aren't terribly useful. Yes, you can meet people off the apps and you can get it done faster than that. But generally, and from my personal experience, I find that when you have really, really short trips into town, the apps are not necessarily the best way to approach things.
I blame the popularity of these apps now, because if this was like 7 years ago when you were using Tinder, you would get a match within like 30 seconds and you'd be seeing that person like within the hour.
Oh my God, Tinder 7 years ago. Don't even get me started. I went to New York City once when Tinder was still semi-new. We could just spend the whole podcast talking about that.
See, I got out of the Tinder game early. I was living in New York at the time when Tinder first came out, and it was out of this world. Then I moved back to Toronto, and like all I had to do was set my range to, I want to say like 0.2 kilometers, and it was an endless stream, and you could go out every single night and use the app for what you wanted to use it for. I actually met my wife on Tinder, so I got out of the game. But I mean, everyone was using it for exactly the same purpose then. Like now it's basically, I don't know, Lava Life or Plenty of Fish.
Yeah, unfortunately, I also think that the apps have become very diluted with, fake profiles, with people just looking for quick validation for hits, for people looking for social media, Instagram followers, people who just kind of want to chat and bullshit a little bit, but have no intention to actually meet anyone. So yeah, I too long for the golden era of 2013 Tinder, back when. Oh, that's another thing. The apps have become very balkanized. So now there's like 5 to 10 different apps that people use with any regularity. And when everyone who had any intention of meeting someone off the internet was on Tinder, it was much better times. I'll be telling my grandkids about the golden era of Tinder. You kids think you're getting laid on the internet these days? No, let me tell you how it was.
Yeah, we're not even going to have kids in like 20 years. We're just going to have robot kids from Japan or something like that.
Sweet.
Hey, listen, it sounds far more affordable and fewer health risks associated with just buying a robot and trying to raise that up. So you do dress well on TV. Do you have a stylist?
No, I don't. I just my dad started feeding me GQ and Esquire when I was like 10 or 12 or something, so I had to learn young.
I say that's a way to get out of it. And stylists, I wouldn't know, as people say that I dress like an absolute maniac, but it's like 5% out of your pay to pay a stylist. And then you couple that on with having an agent and a publicist, it just becomes too much, doesn't it?
Exactly. And I think whoever's saying that to you is just hating. I like your shirt, your hair looks sharp. I don't know why they're talking trash. You look good.
Well, thank you, Tony. I mean, we don't even need Tinder at this point. Now we're just having a real connection right now.
Exactly. We should just do interview shows, and then everybody would find their soulmate. There you go.
Yeah. Unfortunately, one person has to own a camera, and the other one has to be on a major television show and become a face and color commentator of the. Is WPT is there a rivalry between WPT and the WSOP in terms of the ESPN broadcast versus the Fox broadcast?
I've never really felt that way. And that's not me trying to downplay anything. I just think that poker is an industry that wants to be healthy and has faced enough external adversity that we generally want to see other poker tours and other poker shows perform well, because that we assume there's going to be a spillover there. That, okay, if their events are doing well, then our events will probably do well. That if our events are getting a ton of entrants, their events will probably get a ton of entrants. That, when you see another tour, another show do well, it's probably indicative of the health of the industry and not something all that special about our show, about their tour, about whatever it is. I think that we just generally want to see, did they get good numbers? Okay, great.
So you talk about raising the health of the game, getting everything back to very peak levels. So April 15th, 2011, probably a day you remember very well. Not a great day for the industry and not a great day for you. How did you find out about it? Did you know it was coming? I mean, outside of 24 hours in advance, or did it just kind of hit and you were like, oh, fuck?
To this day, I don't believe that anybody knew that it was coming. I think that we were all equally blindsided. I logged on to Full Tilt and Poker Stars like I did every morning. I was going to register some tournaments, go about my day, and come back and play them later that afternoon. And instead, I got that message about the sites being shut down by the DOJ. And I was living in a household with a number of other poker players at the time, and we were all just floored and really didn't know what to do or how to respond. And we immediately started discussing, well, how big of a thing is this? How serious and permanent is this change? And, day one was all just speculation. We were all just trying to figure out, how bad is this exactly?
So when does it set in as this is the new norm? This is reality, and I got to figure out what to do now?
Probably within 48 hours, when we came to understand that, okay, online poker, as we know it in the United States, is dead. Our money is locked up, and we knew at the time that it was not that likely that everybody would be able to pay us. I remember thinking wow, there's no way these shady bastards at UB are going to actually pay us out our money. They didn't end up paying us. They did end up screwing us. UB did end up not paying out their players, but very, very recently, UB players did get paid back, not as a result of anyone associated with UB. Don't want to give them any credit. It was actually a result of Poker Stars paying to buy Full Tilt, and then when players reclaimed their balances on Full Tilt, there was such a disparity between how much had been given for player balances and how much was claimed that the whatever company had been employed by the government to do these distributions basically said, okay, well, all the full tilt players who have actually claimed their funds have been made whole, and we still have this pool of ultimate bet players who have not been made whole, and we have enough money to pay them out as well. So some credit goes to poker stars there for having paid that much money for full tilt that it eventually, I guess, trickled down into the hands of UB players.
So when you are dealing with the fallout of this, like the few weeks after, like what are the potential options that you're weighing? Clearly you guys are out a lot of money, life-changing money. Like, are you thinking about like, hey, I'm going to move to Mexico and continue to play online poker there? Like, what are the next steps to walk through?
I was employed with the World Poker Tour at the time, so I knew I was not going to move away because we are based out of Los Angeles, and a lot of the events that I traveled to within the United States. Plus, I had most of my money online, and my ability to pay for a whole bunch of flights was not very realistic at the time. My friends, the guys that I was living with, all moved abroad, within weeks. They all just kind of left. So I'd been living in this house with 3 or 4 other guys, and then a couple weeks later it was just empty, and I was home alone and more or less broke and very, very frustrated. So a lot of guys moved to Malta, to Mexico, to the UK, Germany, Canada. Most of my friends moved to Canada or Mexico at that time. And that was the reality of an online poker player in the years immediately following Black Friday.
So how long does it take you to get back on your feet and feel comfortable playing live poker? All of a sudden, that is your only option that you can really get into. Obviously, you have the broadcasting, and that's
Right.
that's a great place to be because you're always around it. But it must have been just awful for a while.
I was really upset. I mean, like I said, I had most of my money online. It was locked up. And it's not just the fact that you lost all your money overnight. It's just the epic betrayal you feel from your industry and from a lot of figures who were propped up by, the poker media as these paragons of the industry who turned out to be guys who had either positioned us to fail or had looked the other way or had been very negligent. And as a result, the whole thing came crashing down. None of us had money anymore. A lot of our faith was destroyed. And so I didn't really play poker very much for like a year following that. I was just so, I just didn't have the heart, I guess. I was too exhausted. And so I spent like a year and a half playing the occasional live tournament and nothing else. And then eventually I was like, well, look, this is still my career. I'm still living in Las Vegas. I need to derive an income from this. And so I went back to casinos and I started at like 2.5 no limit and rebuilt my bankroll like I was 17 or 18 all over again.
So what leads up to the big success in 2016 then when you go wild and start winning? You want a bracelet? You want a bunch of cash? Like, did you feel that was coming based on your play over the previous 6 months, previous year, that you were getting to a point where you're like, hey, I'm peaking right now, I'm in the zone? Or was it just like, hey, I went on a good run, I just played the same way I always do, and everything broke my way?
Yeah, very much the second half of that. In 2015, I had a really bad year at poker. I cashed one live poker tournament out of, I don't know, dozens. And I had essentially shifted my focus to daily fantasy sports. I had a really good year at daily fantasy sports, and I was finding poker really frustrating. And I was like, you know what? I'm just not going to play this because it's making me unhappy. And then I went down to Australia to just kind of like visit a place that had been very special to me and to play in the Aussie Millions. And I had this crazy occurrence where I like dropped a chip in line to register and then walked out the door intending to not even play at all because I was so frustrated. And then a friend like free-rolled me in the tournament and I went deep. I had this great score, and then I was like, well, damn, I guess I can still do this. Let's go play a whole bunch more tournaments. And then I just went on this crazy run. So I hadn't been practicing, studying, working on my game, thinking about poker very much at all for a year preceding the 6 months that were the best of my career. So I cannot stress enough how much luck and variance and chaos goes on in any career involving gambling or risk. It was at the moment that I least expected to have a career year is when it finally happened.
Does that mean that it is essential to embrace the variance?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, especially if you want to keep your sanity.
We always try to preach this in terms, especially when it comes to like DraftKings golf, is that you could have a losing month, like a bad losing month. But in terms of baseball, that's 4 days. that you always forget that you have to understand what the sample is on some of these things. That, hey, I just lost every tournament from March to the middle of April. Like that's 6 days on a baseball slate. Eventually these things will come around. You just have to be able to live through those down stretches. So when you start playing in daily fantasy sports, playing on DraftKings, what are the sports that you're focusing on the most when you start out?
When I started out, the industry was growing at such a rapid pace that there was still overlay in a lot of contests. So I would learn new games really, really quickly as their season started and then hunt overlay. So I remember, let's see, this would have been the 2015 baseball season. There was a 1K on DraftKings that was going to overlay by like, I don't know, there was like 300 players guaranteed and it was going to get like 220, 230 or something. So I thought like, okay, I've been playing baseball for a week. I really probably don't belong in $1,000 contest, but I think I get the hang of this and overlay is overlay. So let's just fire here. And I was very fortunate that I had some success early in my DFS career. So I started with football, then quickly changed over to baseball. That season started, and then a couple months later, maybe like a month later, I started dabbling in NBA. It was playoff time around then. Probably somebody said, hey, there's a big golf tournament coming up. You should try that. So just whatever came up, whenever there was a big contest, I was just down to try it and to learn the skill set necessary.
Do you find that the skill set in analyzing the player pool, obviously some of the statistics and advanced stats are going to be different, but the general strategy between picking a baseball DraftKings roster, an NBA DraftKings roster, and a PGA or NFL DraftKings roster differs that much in terms of strategy? Like, are you always just trying to leverage yourself against the field in these large field tournaments?
I do think there's a pretty strong difference between the sports. Like you said, the most important thing is leveraging yourself against the field and making sure that you're not all over the high-owned plays, or at least have some really low-owned plays mixed in with your chalk. With football and basketball, I think you need much stronger degrees of correlation on your team. Obviously, in golf, I don't know that anything really relevant exists in the realm of correlation. Right?
There are two things. There are two correlation plays you can do in golf that they don't necessarily work out every time, but if they do hit, one is the weather stack. That if there's going to be an immense amount of wind in the afternoon, you just take all guys from the morning or vice versa. And that way you can eliminate one half. Like even last week, it actually worked out that when we talked about like the RBC Heritage, the morning wave both days actually did rather well. So it balanced itself out because both guys got the shitty end of the tee draw. But sometimes it'll just work out the other way. Like for the Valero 2 years ago, the scoring average in the morning was like 78.5, and the afternoon wave was like 73. And only like 3 guys made the cut from the morning wave. So if you just did it that week, it really worked out. The other one is a correlation of skill sets. So, hey, I'm going to take Dustin Johnson, John Rahm, Jonathan Vegas, Grayson Murray, all guys that hit the ball 320 yards plus, and really hope that this is a week where driving distance really pays off. So you can correlate stats that way in golf too, but is not as significant as you would see as like a lineup stack in baseball or a quarterback, wide receiver stack in football, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and my understanding is the guys who are doing the very, very best at this now, especially in NBA and NFL, are finding ways to build stacks that are really strongly correlated. And so, in something like NFL, you're often, stacking quarterback, receiver, and maybe even 2 players from the opposing team and hoping for an absolute shootout game. In the NBA, you might stack, 6 players from one game, anticipating overtime, not even anticipating, just hoping for overtime, really. So as you said, like I'm not an expert on golf DFS to anywhere near the level that you are, and there's less correlation factors in play there. And at the end of the day, most of what I'm trying to concentrate on is ownership. I think if you're going to be a GPP player, that ownership is really the name of the game. And if you are routinely playing too much chalk, you don't really have a chance.
Well, one of the big advantages I think that a lot of people from the poker world coming over to daily fantasy is simply tournament selection. And the first thing you said, hey, there's a lot of overlay in this. I can attack this tournament. Even if I'm not the highest skilled player potentially that's going to enter this tournament, I see an opportunity here. And I think a lot of people that just got into DraftKings and go to the lobby, they're like, oh, that one pays out $600,000, not even looking at the payout structure, the amount of teams that are in it versus some of the other tournaments. I just think having that experience coming from the poker world is a gigantic advantage.
Yeah, it's a huge advantage in terms of game selection. And then also, embracing variance like we spoke about before and accepting that there's going to be a lot of losing involved. There's going to be some extended losing streaks. And then, there's just a bunch of qualities as a poker player in terms of the way you analyze information and the way you implement something new that you've learned. I mean, like with NBA, for example, you got to make some really, really quick changes leading up to lineup lock. And so being able to make these quick decisions and having sort of like a decision tree in your mind of, okay, well, if A happens, then I need to do B. And if, like B happens, then I need to do C. And then if C happens, I need to do D. And then, all the way down the tree. That's the type of thing you practice as a poker player that is very helpful when you need to make these quick decisions in daily fantasy sports.
I've talked to a lot of DFS professionals and a lot of people that have started their own businesses, and I think a lot of this is just from the poker players that said, that I was in university with, and they were like, screw this, I'm going to go play poker full time, and they've made a very good living doing it. Is there a mix of an entrepreneurial spirit that comes along with some of these things? It's the betting on yourself element of it that really sucks people in?
Yeah, there is a natural risk-taking inherent in poker players and people who work in finance, who work in daily fantasy sports, gambling. If you're going to work in that field at all, you have to be comfortable betting on yourself, betting against the wisdom of crowds. You have to be willing to.
Well, how much of it is I just know better than everyone else? I'm smarter than them.
Depends on your player. For many poker players or daily fantasy sports players, that side of their personality is really apparent. And I'm sure you've run into that type before. I think that guys at the highest levels have become very good at questioning what they know and doing their best to avoid the confirmation bias. I mean, I think that most people out there just have no idea about something like the confirmation bias and are just like, okay, well, I think this thing is true, and I found a piece of information that supports what I think is true, therefore I'm right. And once you understand the confirmation bias, a lot of your job becomes, okay, I think this thing is true. So now let me do everything I can to disprove this. And if I cannot disprove it, then I guess I will grudgingly accept that it is true. And so I think when you see people who are being arrogant or overly certain about something that they think or believe, that's the confirmation bias at work. And that's them being like, look, I believe this thing is true and I found something to support it. Therefore, I'm right.
My friend Mike Leone, very good daily fantasy player, and he owns dailyroto.com, along with another very successful DFS player, Drew Dinkmeyer. One of the things that he told me one time, he's a very confident guy. He makes good selections, and he understands that sometimes he's going to be wrong. But he told me the most important thing that you need to know is just understand what you don't know, and then trust people who are smarter than you about that one thing. Once you start doing that, then you have the full pie.
I could not agree more, and those two guys do such an awesome job over at Daily Roto. I listen to their podcast anytime I'm about to do a big slate, so yes, I could not agree more.
All right, so before we get out of here, I just want to ask you some more fun questions. You've lived all over the world and traveled to all these places. Like, you lived in China. What's living in China like?
A little frustrating because I couldn't speak any Chinese, and I was living in a part of Shanghai that was far enough out that no one could really speak English to me, so it was a little bit lonely in that way. But it was fascinating from a cultural standpoint and learning about a very different approach to life and society while I was there. I love their hours of operation in China and across most of Asia, which is it's 24 hours. Of course, you can have whatever you want. And there's a lot of I really appreciate how considerate Chinese are of others in their presence. So if you go to dinner or you have a meeting or something, there's a really high level of consideration to interaction there. And that was something that you don't get quite as much in the United States. We are so individualistic that at times we tend to prioritize, hey, just be yourself over considering others. And, then you go somewhere like China where it is this enormous priority to consider others and to consider how you are being perceived in your treatment of others. That is just refreshing coming from where I was from. But then there are some other aspects to living in a country like that that are really, really frustrating, like the language thing, for example, or I remember just the pace was really frustrating. Like it was such a rat race culture there that at times I felt like, I was going to get trampled, or people were always trying to cut me in line, or there was just a very different standard for what rudeness is across cultures, and you learn those edges as you spend more and more time abroad.
So when you go to Australia and start living there, I've never been to Australia. I always just assumed it would be like hot Canada, but is that close?
Yes, it is actually. It is kind of like hot Canada with accents. It's an amazing country. Yeah, Australia is a really it's still, I think, my favorite place that I've been to this day. It's just incredible place. And Melbourne in particular is such a really cool multicultural city. But yeah, Australia, the weird thing about Australia is has this image is this very like outdoorsy, like dangerous, everything's trying to kill you place. And in reality, a massive percentage of the population in Australia lives in a few urban centers because most of the center of the island is uninhabitable. So like people are like, oh yeah, Australia, the outback. And I'm like, no, Australia, the land of cities.
Well, it's funny. Canada's set up the exact same way. I feel like very few Americans, even Canadians, might not know that 9 out of 10 Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. It's all concentrated in one place. Did you see any of those spiders that are like as big as your hand?
No, I never saw any crazy wildlife unless I was at like a zoo or something,
You should have wandered to the outback a little bit to get, I don't know, I guess you don't want to get full Steve Irwin, but like to see one of those spiders, it would freak the fuck out of me, but it seems like one of the essential parts, doesn't it?
I saw penguins once. Does that help?
That's not bad. I saw penguins in Hawaii once. They did not seem happy.
They're just chilling on islands sometimes. It's not all, poles for them.
So you go China, you go Australia, outside of the United States. Have you lived anywhere else?
To the point I had an apartment there, not quite, but I've spent like a lot of time in some other cities to the point where it felt like I was living there. Budapest comes to mind. I've just had so many trips there, often for extended stays. I feel like I could maneuver myself around Budapest pretty easily. Montreal started to feel like that. Las Vegas, of course. Those are the main ones, I would say, of the cities I spent the most time in. And then a lot of these other places I spent anywhere from a few days to a month in them. But it's pretty rare that I get to stay in one place longer than a month. And even that's a lot of time over the last few years.
Well, you're from Wisconsin, and when you first leave, do you go to Vegas? Do you go to LA? Did you go to Australia? What was the first place you left Wisconsin to move to?
I went to Australia first. I won a package on Party Poker to go down and play the Aussie Millions in like '05 or something. And ended up doing study abroad there and staying put in Australia for a few years, actually. And then I came back to the United States and moved to Las Vegas after that.
So is it a big culture shock leaving Wisconsin? And I mean, obviously traveling halfway around the world and going to Australia is, but even just the juxtaposition between like Wisconsin and Las Vegas, the day-to-day life, because I figure if you move to Las Vegas, like, do you live basically on the Strip? Because most people in Las Vegas who are like from Las Vegas live in those like weird outskirt areas and never go down to the Strip.
Right. No, you're absolutely right about that. Most Las Vegas locals are not really trying to go to the Strip. Unless they work there or maybe during the week for a good meal or to play poker or something, but they have
a hockey team to go down and root for now. Apparently that's a real big deal.
Yes, oh man, that city is crazy for that team. I remember when they announced it, I was like, professional sports isn't going to work in Vegas. Those people are loyal to nothing. And I was so wrong. That team is very important to that city. And obviously they're being so good right away is extremely helpful.
Do you think that football is going to end up working there?
After seeing the way the city has responded to the hockey team, yes. Again, I was kind of a doubter when I first heard about it. But I think there is great enthusiasm there. And, look, so many people are just going to travel into Las Vegas to watch a road game for their team that the stadium is going to be a little bit of just kind of like an alternating road game for the Raiders. But I still think that the team is going to do well there. I don't know about bringing back John Gruden. I will say I'm not a Gruden hater or anything. It's just, look, I have played a game at really high competitive levels, and I've seen what those worlds are like when you're trying to beat the other best in the world at something. And if you were to spend like 10 years out of the game and then just be like drop back into it and expect it to excel, that's ridiculous to me. And I think that coaching an NFL team is one of those amongst the most competitive in the world type jobs. And that is the competition that John Gruden is now up against, 10 years removed from, I mean, I know he won a Super Bowl, but like he wasn't some killer coach down in Tampa Bay. So we'll see about all this.
Well, it's setting up for a perfect storm of gambling because he's going to come back, and hopefully the Raiders are terrible because he's not very good. They'll move to Las Vegas, and then the Vegas Raiders will get the same bump that the Vegas Knights got, that when every team came to town, they just went out and partied for their first trip through, and Las Vegas just dusted them the next day. Yeah. So for the first year, betting the over on the Raiders, especially if their win total is like 5.5, just pound the over.
I bet that will absolutely be a factor. And I remember reading somewhere that in the NBA, if a visiting team has had like an off day prior to their game against the Lakers or the Clippers, they like failed to cover the spread some remarkable percentage of the time if they just had like one extra day to go out and party in LA before the game. So I'm sure there will be something like that in play with Las Vegas. But I do think that commercially that the team is going to do really well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a good attraction. For people coming in, and the Raiders are already a national fan base that this can only it makes them more accessible for fans across the country to go see. It's not that it's much easier to get to Vegas than it is to Oakland, but if you're going to spend 5 days in San Francisco versus 5 days in Vegas, it could get pricier in Vegas, but you can do it for a whole lot cheaper too if you wanted.
Yes, absolutely. I just stayed in San Francisco, and you know what? As much as you lose in Vegas, I'm not sure it could be more expensive.
So the only other thing, like line-wise, like that, like the Clippers, and even for the Knicks, it can work out that way. Just the Knicks are always a disaster. There was the Toronto Sunday at 1 Eastern game that used to suck people in because apparently, I guess living here, I know this, but I didn't realize that like a lot of other cities, all their strip clubs aren't like directly within 5 minutes of the arena and all the hotels that everyone stays in. So that early game Sunday, the Raptors would always cover that spread.
I wish I had known that. I would have made some money. Thank you for that one. I hope it's still true.
I didn't really track it this year, but it was a thing for like 3 or 4 years. Last thing though, Bond 18, your screen name in poker. I'm a big Bond fan as well. I don't want to go into a full debate of ranking every single movie. Top three Bond movies.
Top 3 Bond movies. Ooh, wow. Excellent question. I will put GoldenEye up there. I don't think objectively it belongs, but it is the Bond movie that I grew up with. And then the N64 game was so awesome. So I got to put it up there. And it was the only good.
Hold on 1 second. There you go right there.
Exactly. See, you know what I'm talking about.
I will say, not a great movie.
And look, and that was his best one. So the 90s were kind of rough for Bond.
Yeah. I'll say I'm going to throw out Goldfinger. Goldfinger has always been my favorite.
Total classic, Pussy Galore, Odd Job, Blofeld, that one had it all. That was a real classic Bond movie.
Well, does Casino Royale make you upset when you see the poker scene at the end?
No, I've just gotten used to like movie poker being completely ridiculous cooler hands. That's all right. They made it look really stylish and like fun and suave, and so I appreciated that. But I think if I was going to include a Daniel Craig Bond movie, it would be Skyfall. I think that's my favorite of the 3. And I think he's been awesome as Bond. I'm very happy to see he's coming back for one more movie. I guess they offered him all the money in the world to make that happen. So that's a good thing for Bond fans.
I'm trying to think. I really didn't like Roger Moore as James Bond, and I liked Dalton as I didn't like. It's a weird way to phrase this. I thought that Roger Moore represented Bond in my mind more than Timothy Dalton, but the 2 Timothy Dalton movies were just way better than all the Roger Moore movies.
100%.
It was like Pierce Brosnan is Bond in my mind, but his movies are no good.
Right. The tricky thing is, Roger Moore's take on Bond was almost comic. He was kind of like, this isn't serious. Timothy Dalton's was like too far off the other end, where he was like, this is a really serious, brooding anti-hero. And then Pierce Brosnan was kind of just the right amount of like fun and violence, but also his scripts were terrible. And so finally we've landed with Daniel Craig, who has managed to combine a lot of what is the best about Bond with some actually good scripts and directing.
Who do you think gets Bond next? Any early candidates?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the question. I know that Idris Elba was floated out there. I think he would be great. I'm trying to think. What's the name of the guy from Billions?
Damian Lewis?
Damian Lewis.
He seems a bit old, though, doesn't he? By the time they get around to him.
I think that when they were looking at replacing Daniel Craig, his name had come up quite a bit. But now I think that Daniel Craig signed on for one more movie. He's probably a little too old. And then Henry Cavill is a guy who, here's my little Bond fun fact. Henry Cavill almost got the part of James Bond when he was like 21 years old, and they were casting Casino Royale. He was basically like on the cusp of getting the part, and then they were just like, I guess he's just a little too young. I think he would probably be good. He certainly has the right look and pedigree of films to be a good Bond, but I do find him a little lacking on camera at times, so I don't know.
So when they make the new set of movies, obviously the new Daniel Craig one will mimic the same tone as the other ones, but it seemed like after The Dark Knight came out that they were like, oh, superhero movies can be super serious. And it seems like these Bond movies are super serious and influence a lot the same way. Do you think it flips back to a bit more fun Bond?
I think it's going to depend on who they entrust to write and direct the upcoming movies and how financially successful the latest one is. So if the latest one is kind of a serious Bond movie and it does really well at the box office, my guess is they are not going to mess with a winning formula and they're going to try and do something pretty similar. Whereas if it's, if it does okay or it's kind of a flop, then they might say like, hey, audiences want something new, so we're going to try something different.
All right. Tony Dunst. You can follow him on Twitter at Tony Dunst TV. Congratulations, dude, on becoming the new, I guess, face of the World Poker Tour. It's amazing.
Thanks so much. I'm just very, very happy to be there.
When does filming start? When does the season start?
Well, filming has already commenced, and actually the season with myself and Vince in the booth will begin on April 29th on Fox Sports Net.
All right, so now that you're dabbling with Fox in terms of poker, does that mean you're going to be on? I just saw Fox release that they're going to do 45 hours of U.S. Open coverage. Are they going to have you on the broadcast breaking down the odds?
Wow, I would love that, but my guess is no.
If you do, I mean, don't be afraid to call me into that one. Just saying.
All right, yeah, they're like, oh, Pat, I need the hot picks. Where's the strip clubs at around this golf tournament, and which of the players are likely to end up there?
I have serious answers to that question, by the way, but I'll keep that for a different show. All right, thanks for being on the line, man. I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at the PME. And remember, subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience. All audio versions free anywhere and uncensored, where you can download podcasts, plus the video versions up on the DraftKings YouTube page and the DK Live app. I'm Pat Mayo. Thanks for hanging. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!